What if the biggest question surrounding NWBO stock right now isn't whether DCVax-L works, but whether the market is completely underestimating what happens if the regulatory story finally turns in Northwest Biotherapeutics' favor? NWBO is trading around the 17-cent area, and at this price, the stock can look almost irrelevant compared with the big names in biotech. But here's where things get interesting. Because NWBO isn't just waiting around for some random clinical trial result, the company is waiting for a potentially massive regulatory catalyst involving DCVax-L, its personalized cancer vaccine candidate for glioblastoma. And believe me, there is one recent development that investors absolutely need to know about. So in this video, I'm going to break down my 2026 outlook for NWBO, my price targets, the bull case, the bear case, and finally, whether I would personally buy, hold, or sell at these levels. And stay until the end, because my answer isn't as simple as buy or sell. Let's get into it. First, let's talk about the biggest development. On July 20th, 2026, Northwest Biotherapeutics addressed rumors that the UK's MHRA had rejected its marketing application for DCVax-L. And this is where things got interesting. The company said it contacted the MHRA for clarification. The regulator confirmed that the application remains under its initial regulatory review. In other words, it has not been rejected. And it has not been withdrawn. The review is still progressing toward a first regulatory decision. Now that doesn't mean approval is guaranteed. That's extremely important. But it does remove one major fear that had been circulating around the stock. And honestly, this is exactly why NWBO is such a dangerous stock to underestimate and such a dangerous stock to blindly buy. Because one major regulatory decision could potentially change the entire valuation story. Now let's talk about the science. In July, NWBO presented updated survival data from its Phase 3 DCVax-L trial for glioblastoma. The company said the updated individual patient level analysis suggested that the original analysis may have underestimated the survival extension. That's obviously interesting, but investors need to separate two things: positive clinical data and regulatory approval. They are not the same thing. A drug can have encouraging data and still face regulatory problems. And that's the biggest risk I see with NWBO right now. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because if the regulatory process moves in NWBO's favor, the stock doesn't necessarily need to stay at 17 cents. And that's where we need to talk about the possible price scenarios. So let's look at what could happen next. Now here's my first price scenario. If the regulatory process continues without a major negative surprise, but we don't get a major commercial breakthrough, I think NWBO could potentially trade around the 0.30 to 0.60 area during 2026. That's my base case scenario. Remember, we're talking about a highly speculative OTC biotech, so volatility could be extreme. But now comes the exciting scenario. What happens if DCVax-L gets a positive regulatory decision and investors suddenly start pricing NWBO as a potential commercial oncology company instead of a development stage biotech? That's where things could get very interesting. In a strong bull case, I could see the stock potentially testing the $1 to $2 range. And yes, from roughly 17 cents, that would represent a huge percentage move. But here's the twist. I'm not saying NWBO is going to $2. I'm saying that a successful regulatory and commercial outcome could create the conditions where those levels become possible. There is a massive difference. And that's exactly why I wouldn't treat this stock like a normal company. Now let's talk about the bear case. If regulatory uncertainty continues for much longer, if the company needs additional financing, if commercialization takes longer than expected, or if the regulatory outcome disappoints investors, NWBO could remain under pressure. In that scenario, I wouldn't be surprised to see the stock revisit the $0.10 area, or potentially even lower. And that's why this stock isn't suitable for someone who can't handle extreme volatility. But here's the question. Would you personally take that risk for the possibility of a much bigger upside? Because this is where NWBO becomes really interesting. You have a stock trading around pennies, but potentially facing a catalyst that could completely change investor sentiment. And that's exactly why I'm watching one level very closely. That level is 0.30. If NWBO can move toward or above that area with strong volume and meaningful regulatory progress, I think the conversation around this stock could change very quickly. But whether that happens, that's the million-dollar question. So, Buy, hold, or sell? Here's my personal take. At around the pseudo-17 level, I would classify NWBO as a high-risk speculative hold rather than an obvious buy. If I already owned shares, I would personally be watching the regulatory developments very closely instead of panic selling based on rumors. But if I were considering a new position, I would keep the position size small because the outcome can still go either way. The upside could be enormous, but so could the downside. And here's the number I'm personally watching. For me, JOY 30 is an important psychological level. If NWBO can move above that area with strong volume and meaningful regulatory progress, the market could start treating the story very differently. Then 0.50 becomes interesting. And above $1, that's where I think the entire investment thesis would need to be reassessed, because we'd potentially be looking at a completely different market perception of the company. So my 2026 scenario looks like this. Bear case, 0.10 or below. Base case, 0.30 to 0.60. Bull case, $1 to $2 or more if major regulatory and commercial catalysts materialize. Again, these are my scenario-based estimates. They're not guaranteed price targets. And personally, I think the risk-reward is interesting enough to watch very closely, but not safe enough for me to call NWBO a guaranteed buy. Now I want to hear from you. If NWBO gets a positive regulatory decision, what do you think happens first? Does the stock reach 0.50? Does it break $1? Or do you think the market has already priced in too much optimism? Drop your NWBO price target in the comments. And if you own NWBO right now, tell me honestly, are you holding for 0.50, $1, $2, or are you waiting for the regulatory decision before making your move? If you enjoyed this analysis, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because I'll be following NWBO's next major developments closely. And remember, with speculative biotech stocks, the biggest gains can come with the biggest risks. Do your own research, manage your risk, and never invest money you can't afford to lose. I'll see you in the next one.